What about the food guidelines? The food pyramid, as you and I know it, was signed off by the grain companies who had excess grain in storage and they needed to sell it. Dr. Ansel Keys, for instance, was sponsored by the Kellogg's company. If you go to my blog, carnivoreway.blogspot.com, you'll see video number 3, where Nina Teichels, the author of The Big Fat Surprise, testified to the fact. And she also exposes the seed oil companies and sugar companies who influenced data and buried studies like the Minnesota dietary experiment, coronary experiment, the Minnesota coronary experiment that ran from 1968 to 1973, and at a mortality rate of 62% on the unsaturated fat. With other words, they had two groups. One group were eating unsaturated fat, canola and sunflower oil in their diet, and the other group had saturated fat. And the saturated fat, animal fat people died less than the unsaturated fat. The mortality rate was 62% higher for the canola and sunflower oil. The only trouble is that this particular study were hidden for 16 years because of the fact that the mortality rate did not prove what they wanted to prove. They wanted to prove that saturated fat is bad for you and that unsaturated fat is good for you. And it was the opposite case. The same happened with the Sydney Diet Heart Study, 1966 to 1973. And the same happened for 13 years until 2013. The study did not come out. And again, the mortality rate for the unsaturated fat, for the canola and sunflower oil group, were higher than the saturated fat group. So Dr. Ansel Keys, for instance, studied 22 nations. He was even in South Africa, and he was the guy that said don't eat butter because it will give you cholesterol. And today we know that's not how biology works. It is insulin resistance that is the cause of heart disease. It is high triglyceride levels that has a 2.1 risk factor, as opposed to the high LDL, which is only 1.6 risk factor for heart disease, according to the Women's Health Initiative study for 10,000 women that ran, for 28,000 women that ran over a 10-year period. The highest risk factor is, in fact, type 2 diabetes, with a 10.7 risk factor for heart disease, and below that is metabolic syndrome with a risk factor of 6.0. Then you get a risk factor of 4.3 for obesity, and then you get a risk factor for 4.5 for hypertension. So with the carnivore diet, we are reversing those things. We are reversing high triglyceride levels. We are reversing insulin resistance. We are reversing metabolic syndrome. We are reversing type 2 diabetes. And we are reversing hypertension. So hypertension happens when you are insulin resistant because of eating excess carbohydrates, and you end up with high glucose levels, and that triggers your pancreas to secrete insulin, and the insulin takes the glucose out of the blood and it puts it into triglycerides around the liver. So you get a fatty liver and you become fat because of the high insulin levels. So insulin is continuing to be secreted because you continue to eat too many carbohydrates and you continue to have too high glucose levels in the blood. And what ends up happening is you become chronic hyperinsulinemic. and that means that the insulin is not effective anymore, but you're insulin resistant. You are chronically hyperinsulinemic. You have too high levels of insulin. So insulin regulates salt retention and uric acid retention in the kidneys. But what happens with insulin resistance, it upregulates the salt retention and it upregulates the uric acid retention. So you have hypertension and you have gout and arthritis. So we are reversing all those factors with the carnivore diet. So the carnivore diet consists of only animal products, and we cook with animal fat or with butter, and we don't use any sugary sauces. We cook with single spice ingredients, and we keep sweet taste out of our mouth. We don't eat any fruit or vegetables or any starch or any grains, only animal products. So basically any type of animal meat, fish that you can think of, and dairy is allowed if you can tolerate it. And that is basically in a nutshell what we consume. So it's basically a zero carbohydrate diet, except for cheese. It does have some carbohydrates in it, but all the nutrition that you need is in animal products. You don't need to eat any plants material at all. And in fact, there are 5 nutrients that's found in animal products that you won't find in plants, and it's collagen, carnitine, taurine, cholesterol, and vitamin B12. We also don't calorie restrict on the carnivore diet, and we eat until we are satiated. So there's no meal plan, and you eat until you are full, and you can eat again, and you can eat as many times per day as you like. So check out the other frequently asked questions, and check out the videos on the blog, most of which the doctors made. There's 123 videos at this time. So because the carnivore diet is the ultimate elimination diet, and because we are not consuming any plant toxins, many people who suffered from things like irritable bowel syndrome, even constipation, Crohn's disease, experience relief with the carnivore diet, because within plants are defense mechanisms, polyphenols, lectins, oxalates, and other plant hormones, and we are not consuming any plant hormones at all. And fiber actually is not beneficial. It's beneficial if you eat a high carbohydrate diet, and it's beneficial if you consume a lot of plant toxins, but you don't need any fiber for a good bowel movement. See video number 60 on my blog. So people who got benefit from other types of diets, like the ketogenic diet and a Banting diet, and did, for instance, experience weight loss, but still had inflammation in their body, managed to rid themselves of inflammation by following the carnivore diet. So the carnivore diet is the ultimate elimination diet. It may not be for everyone, but it does have merit, and there's a success story link on my blog. If you click the link in the description below, you'll see a Rivero success stories, and you can type in things like IBS or inflammation, and you'll see how many people rid themselves of inflammation. Also, some of the videos on my blog, of the 123 videos, are interviews with people that suffered from things like Crohn's disease, even bipolar, MS, things like Hashimoto's, etc., that found relief with the carnivore diet. There's also success stories of people that were following the carnivore diet for more than 10 years, 12 years, etc. Video number 110 to 112, 113 on my blog. Furthermore, on the nutritional studies, many times health questionnaires will be given out and people will be asked, what did you eat for the last 3 years? And then they would say they ate so many cups of broccoli and they ate so many cups of meat, etc. And then people will fill in the questionnaire and they will discover what kind of illnesses were noticed. And according to that questionnaire, they will then get to a conclusion. And often what will happen is in these kinds of studies is they would say, because the people ate meat and there were a specific type of illness, let's say cancer, there's a correlation. And so nutritional studies is often not very scientific in that regard, because how was the meat prepared? Were there seed oils involved? Were there alcohol consumed? Were there starch ate with the meat? What was, were there cold drinks that were involved with the food? So often they would only look at the one thing that they want to blame, for instance, the meat, but they don't look at the seed oils, which is known to cause a mortality rate of 62% higher than animal fat. But because it's unethical to do studies where, like for instance, on animal studies, you can put people or you can put animals on a strict diet and test them to get cancer, etc. But you can't do it in human trials, of course. So this is the kind of food frequency questionnaires that you get, that they jump to conclusions. So they don't count many points in my books. The other type of study that you get is the animal type of study. And what we saw is that they would, for instance, make rats susceptible to get cancer. And then they would put them, for instance, on a meat diet. And then if some of the rats got cancer, they would say, this is because of the meat that they ate, because they had a bias towards meat. And of course, that does not count a lot of points in my books, because first of all, they made the rats genetically susceptible and chemically susceptible to get cancer. And secondly, of course, they are rats, they are not humans. The human nutritional or the human digestive tract is more similar to a pig than to a rat. So, any case, another interesting point on Dr. Ansel Keys is he studied 22 nations. He was a biologist and he studied 22 nations. He was even in South Africa, and he brought out a 7-nation study. Of course, he's the doctor that said, don't eat butter, don't eat animal fat, because that will give you cholesterol. And of course, we know that's not true at all. It was 1951. But here's the reason why people are still taking cholesterol medication, in the hopes of reducing heart disease. But as I said earlier in this video, the real cause of heart disease is type 2 diabetes, with a 10 times higher risk factor than LDL cholesterol. With the carnivore diet, you can expect to get a slightly higher LDL. So your triglyceride count will go down. That is the fat component of cholesterol that goes up when you eat too many carbohydrates. And your HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol, will actually go up. So insulin sensitivity is defined as high HDL and a low triglyceride count. Insulin resistance is defined as low HDL and high triglycerides. So this is not the way that you want it. So anyway, just to further the point on plant material, plant proteins, for instance, all those plant hormones that I mentioned, the polyphenols and various other chemicals like oxalates and lectins that causes gut permeability and inflammation in the body. Those plant proteins are tied up with those plant chemicals and plant hormones. They are very complex, and that's why you need fiber if you eat a lot of plant material. But on the carnivore diet, we don't eat plant material at all, so we don't ingest those plant toxins, those plant defense mechanisms. Those plant defense mechanisms are not there for your protection or for your benefit. They are there to defend the plant against insects and animals, or for overconsumption and survival. So those plant chemicals causes gut permeability and inflammation in the body and so forth. And that's where fiber, if you ingest those plant chemicals, fiber tends to be a buffer for those against those plant toxins. But on the carnivore diet, we don't consume them. So plant protein is not equal to animal protein. Many people confuse the protein diet. There was a high protein diet. They confuse the high protein diet with the carnivore diet. It's not the same thing. The high protein diet includes plant protein. And as I said, those plant proteins are very complex and often tied up with lectins, which even can cause Parkinson's disease. Go and look at video number 60 on my blog. So see my frequently asked question playlist on YouTube about the various questions, and follow me on TikTok as well. The link to that is in the description below, as well as a link to my blog.